Welcome back, everyone. I know the show has been off for quite a while, but we are back with episode 43. We are making crackers this week, sesame crackers. This is going to be a bit of a shorter episode because crackers, unlike bread, do not need time to rise. So we have a brief 15-minute period in the middle here where the dough will be resting, where I'll do a little bit of our politics, and it's essentially going to be some talk about game theory and why you shouldn't expect too much from the January 6th Commission hearings. So, with that being said, we are going to get started. Again, it's going to be a fairly short episode this week, so don't worry too much about that. We'll be back next week, and if this episode with the crackers is successful, I might do a different style of crackers next week. We'll just have to see. All right, guys, let's get started.
Hey everybody, we're going to start with equal parts of salt and sugar. It's going to be 9 grams each. Once those are in, we're going to add our flour, 300 grams of all-purpose flour. Once our dry ingredients are in the bowl, we're just going to give them a quick mix around to make sure everything is well combined before adding our oil, and that's going to be 75 grams of olive oil. I'm using EVOO. Next up, we have 155 grams of water. Once these are added, all of our ingredients are together, we're going to give those a mix. It's going to start out a little soupy at first. Do not worry, after about 4 or 5 minutes, it'll turn into this lovely, luscious ball. Just remember to scrape down your sides and get everything you need. Next up, we're going to cover this for about 15 minutes so the dough can get nice and collected and make it easier for us to work with. All right, Live Ben, back to you.
All right, so we have brought our dough together. As you saw, it was very quick. Now what we are going to do is we're going to let our dough rest for about 15 minutes, during which we are going to have a quick politics conversation. Again, disguised as game theory. So if you're not here for the politics, that's okay. Just fast forward about 15 minutes and we'll come back and we'll start to shape our crackers. If you are here for the politics, however, we're going to get started in just a second. So, the January 6th Commission hearings have started. They've been going on for about a week now and change. And so I wanted to comment on why you probably shouldn't get too hyped up about the results of the January 6th Commission. And by results, I mean, like, will anyone be held accountable to this, right? Essentially, the who cares factor about any of this. And so I want to come at this from a political science and game theory perspective. This isn't necessarily an issue where being a socialist is particularly helpful, because no system is really well enough designed that the types of things that I'm going to talk about don't happen at all. Although they do happen less frequently in some systems than others. So not only am I going to reference the January 6th Commission hearings in this segment, but I'm also going to talk about Partygate, which is the scandal that Boris Johnson was a part of in the UK, and how he essentially got off scot-free. He survived a no confidence motion that his party held for him a week or so back. And so, I did a whole segment on political accountability, but this isn't necessarily about the importance of political accountability. This is more of a why it won't happen. Okay, so politics in general is what is considered in game theory a repeat player game. Okay, and so backing up for a second, what that means is essentially in many corners of the world, including here in the United States and in the UK, the same groups of people tend to be involved in politics for essentially their entire lives, right? There is a politician class of individuals who actively do the politicking for the country, whether they got in at a young age or a middle age, whatever. You essentially are spending a lot of time with these same people, okay? And by the way, this applies in supranational bodies as well, like the European Union, ECOWAS, and things of that nature, right? So essentially what happens is, as people begin to get more and more familiar with each other and they become to understand each other as people, they are less likely to do things that will hurt the feelings of the other person. And not just hurt the feelings of, but do things which might harm their relationship with that person, right? Now, whether they benefit from that relationship in the short term or the long term, it doesn't really matter. And actually, the actual benefit of the relationship doesn't actually have to come to fruition. It's just the idea that one day this will be an issue that essentially prevents some of the more combative types from staying in politics in the long term. And actually, we're starting to see this Here, the civil war that's been playing out in the United States Democratic Party for the last however many years, the part of the reason that's so non-combative most of the time is because the progressive wing of the Democratic Party still has to work with and get buy-in from the corporate wing of the Democratic Party, right? And in order for them to get those votes, they don't want to insult those members, and vice versa, in theory, because they feel as if they need those votes, and right, they need the assent of those individuals to ascend the ranks into leadership, right? So that's generally what a repeat player game is. And by the way, it doesn't just have to be politics. It can be any situation. If you're in a work environment with other people, you may find yourself, unlikely to criticize someone on your team who does similar work as you, because you may fear that if you need help from them later, they won't give it. They will remember the poor treatment that you gave them, and they will not help you. Okay, and so there are any number of situations to which this applies, but in politics, it's really important from an accountability perspective, because essentially it means that you are less likely to see accountability, to see people held accountable for their wrongdoing, because essentially, if that person is not completely removed from the system, then what ends up happening is that person then goes back with whatever bitter and resentful feelings, and they typically remember who's wronged them, right? And then they may take actions that are similarly harmful against you, right? So you don't want to risk that. So that's essentially the idea of repeat player games. So in the British system, the parliamentary system, and in multi-party systems, and by the way, here, when I say multi-party, I actually mean more than two parties. I know two is technically multiple parties, but a multi-party system as opposed to a two-party or a one-party system, right? So we're talking about more than two viable political parties. There's a whole bunch of theory about what makes a viable political party, but I don't really want to get into it. And I don't have the paper that I studied in college in front of me to give you the proper theory on this, so there's really no point in me going down that rabbit hole. But essentially, you can essentially map a country by the number of viable political parties, and you can create a decimal based on that. And as long as that decimal is greater than 2, that's what's called a multi-party democracy, as opposed to a two-party democracy like we have in the US and other presidential systems, and a one-party democracy like you have in China. Okay, so just laying all the cards on the table here. So if you go to multi-party democracy systems, so France, the UK, Australia, just to name a few examples, one of the things that you tend to notice is that the repeat player problem doesn't really manifest itself as strongly as it might in other situations. Now, why is this? So the reason for this is because essentially there are fewer players who are actually constantly repeat actors, right? So the more parties there are, the more likely it is that the balance of power will shift, and different people will come in and be removed from the system. There will be more cycling out of actual individuals from the system, and because of this, you essentially are breaking up the ability for those members of parliament or those political figures to get to know one another deep enough to be concerned about vengeance, about revenge, and stuff like that, right? So if you have three parties, if you have three viable parties, it's very likely that when seats get switched around, people are going to cycle through those seats, and it might not be the same person standing on the other side of you. And when you don't know that person particularly well, you are more likely to hold them accountable for something they've done wrong, okay? However, this is not always the case, right? So just like we've seen, so as I mentioned earlier, that we've seen Boris Johnson survive a no confidence vote, right? Parliament didn't hold him accountable. They did take some steps in that direction, but they were kind of kneecapped by the British police, who said they were taking care of it, and then Johnson was essentially cleared. His own party was looking at fighting against him, but even though it was a secret ballot, Boris Johnson probably has a sense of who was going to vote against him anyway. And so when the vote came back and he won by a handy margin, it's not particularly surprising, right? Because they fear him as leader of the party. Even if they were to kick him out as leader of the party, he would still be involved in the party. And because of that, it is very unlikely that they would want to go against him, because he is likely to know who it is who is challenging him, and he may take actions using his influence as party leader to harm them later down the road. Okay, so this is worse in America. And like most things when it comes to bad politics, it's worse in America. And so the reason it's worse in America, one, because we're in a two-party system as opposed to a multi-party system, and two, because the incumbent re-election rate in the United States is well over 90%. If you are an incumbent in the United States of America, an incumbent politician at the state and federal level, it is almost guaranteed that you are going to win your re-election, provided you can get through the primary. And even at the primary level, the chance of you getting through there is extremely high. And part of this is money in politics. Some of this has to do with how terribly gerrymandered all of our districts are. But essentially, it doesn't really matter. This is the situation as is. And because of that, you have almost guarantee that all the players will be repetitive, right? And so, by the way, if you look at some of the senators and some of the representatives in the House of Representatives, and you look how long they've been serving in Congress in some way, shape, or form, or presidents who were Congress people first, you essentially notice the fact they've been there for decades. And because of that, and because many of their peers have also been there for decades, you get to this point where you have formed deep relationships with these people who you're working with and in theory against, right? And so because of that, you are very unlikely to hold them accountable. Now, the January 6th Commission is a little different because many of the players who are on the kind of wrong end of the law here are fairly new to politics in some manner, shape, or form, right? Peter Navarro is not exactly a long-term political player. Donald Trump is not exactly a long-term political player. But it doesn't matter because, again, as we discussed earlier, the longevity and the benefits don't actually have to necessarily be realized, right? You can also make a calculated decision about accountability based on the influence of another individual. So, especially when it comes to Trump, it's very unlikely that he is held accountable by the January 6th Commission because many of the people who would be voting for him to be held accountable in some way, shape, or form may still feel some fealty to him, or more importantly, they may be afraid that his influence in the body politic is strong enough that they should not hold him accountable, right? And so they're going to look after themselves too. So even if the repeat player game problem doesn't manifest itself exactly when it comes to the president, right? It does manifest itself when it comes to other interactions that politicians have with each other. By the way, it was kind of interesting when Liz Cheney came out against some other members of the Republican Party, because the Republican Party, by its very nature, is a repeat player game. Almost all of those people have been in Congress for a very long time, or have been, within congressional circles for a very long time. And so for her to kind of step out of line like that kind of breaks the mold of is really an outlier, when it comes to politics around the world, and especially in America. So again, I would say that she's the exception that proves the rule. The fact that almost nobody else wanted to be involved in the January 6th Commission and wanted to turn on members of the Republican Party and what their language was following the Capitol insurrection and Donald Trump's plan to use rogue electors to steal the election, that to me speaks very strongly to the fact that the repeat player game idea is well at work here, okay? So we're actually going to step away from this for a second, and we're going to talk about why specifically in the United States it is very unlikely that Trump will face any consequences whatsoever. And by the way, it's not just Trump, literally any president, okay? So one of the things, and by the way, we're going to talk a little history too to get this. So Nixon was impeached, right, because of the Watergate scandal. Well, I wasn't alive then, but I do remember reading about this guy named Gerald Ford who came after Nixon and then pardoned him. Why did he do this? He didn't have to do this. There is an unspoken rule amongst presidents, and I really do mean unspoken. There's no grand conspiracy here. There's very much, CYA going on here, right? So Gerald Ford knew something that every other president knows, which is that if I prosecute the guy before me, or if I allow the guy before me to go down for something and to be criminally liable for something, then it then opens the door for me, the current president, to be criminally liable for something. Now, Now, of course, the obvious solution here is, well, don't do anything criminal. Okay, fine. I hear you. But for a president, easier said than done, right? So, especially if you look at the Cold War presidents, pretty much everyone after FDR, we, by commission or omission, there were war crimes committed in dozens of countries around the world. Each of those can be led back to the ultimate decider in chief, who was the president. Now, you can make an argument that the FBI had gone rogue a couple times, the CIA had gone rogue a couple times. Doesn't really matter. The president is seen functionally as the head of the American government, and which he is. And so, because of this, you would have to hold the president accountable, criminally accountable, right? So every president has known that if you then go to the president before you and you prosecute them for war crimes or any other crimes that they have committed, regardless of what those crimes might be, it then whoever comes after you is then going to think about prosecuting you for war crimes or whatever other crimes. And by the way, part of the other reason that this unwritten rule exists is because there's serious concern amongst presidents, and not necessarily for a bad reason, that the accusation of presidents of crimes and the execution of the indictments on presidents for crimes may be politically motivated as well, right? And so as soon as you stop, let me back up. As soon as you create a situation where, it looks like your prosecution might be political, the next person is not going to care what's political. They're going to prosecute you anyway. And whether it's revenge for the first guy or whether you did something wrong is not going to matter, because what will matter at the end of the day is whether they have the votes to impeach you and then the political clout to convict you. And once they do that, it becomes a very slippery slope, especially in a situation like the United States, where there's only two parties and where there only ever can be two parties because the way our rule is set up. You get to a really dangerous and sticky situation where you start having all sorts of accusations of crime being lobbed against politicians who didn't necessarily do them, and it becomes politically motivated very quickly. And the reason that this happens, and is more likely to happen in a system like ours, is because there are so few players in it that the vengeance is going to be very real. So you get to a situation where all the incentives point away from indictment, point away from, the accusation of crimes. There are so many fears that people are either thinking about consciously or subconsciously when it comes to things like the January 6th Insurrection Committee hearings and other political projects to hold presidents accountable. It's never going to happen. And because it's never going to happen, presidents are able to take that knowledge, because they know that it's never going to happen, are able to take that knowledge and be more reckless and do more illegal things because of that. Just the last point here, because we are at time, is that we also pulled out of any international agreements that would allow Americans to be held accountable. And so if you combine this particular nugget of information with all the other information I've given you, you'll see that we have an accountability-less culture. And a lack of accountability culture in the U.S., especially when it comes to politics. And this is incredibly dangerous. And actually, in some ways, we are going to see over the next couple of years whether this danger has reached a level of extremity that will cause our democracy to collapse. And I really don't say that flippantly. I'm not saying that as a joke. Again, the January 6th insurrection idea, the people going to the Capitol, that isn't really the danger, right? The danger was a coordinated plan to try and overthrow the democracy through quasi-democratic means, like substituting electors and things like that. So we are really going to see in the next couple of years whether our institutions are strong enough to hold someone who has that kind of plan in check. I genuinely do not know if it will. I'm hopeful. I would like to be hopeful, because I have to live here. There's really nowhere else I can go other than America. And so, you just have to hope that that lack of accountability culture is not strong enough that there's nothing that can be done to stop the most reckless of presidents, right? That someone somewhere believes in the institutions enough and has enough clout with the people in charge to actually make it so. So that's just kind of my point. I just wanted to have this quick conversation on the January 6th Insurrection Committee hearings and just the, about presidential accountability in general. Politics is a bad place for accountability to take place, especially in the US. And we have to find better ways to hold our politicians accountable than the criminal justice system, because it's just never going to happen there, unfortunately.
All right, so we are uncovering our dough. It won't have risen, so don't expect it to, right? We're taking it out onto our board here. No flour on the board, and we're going to divide it into 4 pieces. Now, you should probably divide it into more than this because each one will make more than a regular tray, so just keep that in mind. I recommend 6. Next up, we're going to take some parchment paper about the size of a sheet tray, and we're going to thoroughly flour it. It says lightly flour, but ignore this. Thorough flouring is the way to go. It will stick otherwise, and it may still stick. So just be careful. Make sure to flour all of your work surfaces, the top of your dough, as well as your rolling pin. Make sure you thoroughly roll it there. Also, Ben, people definitely did see you drop that there. You're bad. All right, so now we're going to start rolling it out very carefully. Now, it is going to take a long time for it to come out. Be patient with it. Make sure the parchment paper isn't getting crinkled underneath. Add as much flour as you need. Adding more flour here is not going to hurt your crackers, guys. So do whatever you need to do. Fold it in, roll it out, roll it back in, roll it back out. As long as you get to that beautiful rectangular shape that we want at the end, that's all that matters. So take your time. Next up, now that it's in the right place, we are going to sprinkle generously, I repeat, generously sesame seeds all over there. And then we are going to roll those sesame seeds into the dough. Okay, you're not trying to expand the dough, so the dough expands. Just kind of fold it back in and roll it back into the dough. Just make sure that you have as many sesame seeds packed into there as you possibly can, all right? It's really going to make it taste better in the end. Once this is done, we are going to transfer this to a tray. All right. Now, I actually think you should cut it before putting on the tray. I experienced this the hard way, so I had to do this with a pizza cutter and then a knife, and it was just a giant mess. So really what you should do is, especially if it's all on the piece of parchment, you should just make sure that you run your pizza cutter across it to make whatever size crackers you want. I recommend making them smaller than they recommend 2 inches, just doesn't make sense. And then once you're done that and you have them all the size you wanted, stab that with a fork as many times as possible in those crackers. This is to prevent the crackers from rising. You just want to poke and poke and poke and poke over and over and over and over again until you can finally get to where you need to go. We are going to repeat this process with all of the 4 corners we have, and then we're going to chuck these in an oven at 375 degrees for 14 minutes, 7 per side, okay?
All right, so we have flattened, sesame seeded, rolled, cut all 4 of our pieces of dough here. And because it's taken a while, we've also got some in the oven. We've been cycling some, which means that for the second time in a very long time, we're going to get to taste something that we made for the show on the show. So I have a cracker here. Didn't puff up, which is nice. A little darker than I'd want it to be. I think I'll just hold this up to the camera so you can see. Yeah, because I can't really zoom in here. A little darker than I'd want. I'm not, and the curvature isn't great on this, but honestly, it looks great, so let's just see. That's actually really solid. Great crunch. I don't know if you can hear it through the microphone, but the crunch on this is incredible. It's really good. I like this a lot. Crackers are a good idea. All right, guys. Thanks so much for watching. That's it for this week. I will see you guys next week with a brand new recipe. All right. Take care, everybody. Bye.
Thanks for watching this video, guys. If you liked it, throw a like on it, share with your friends, and subscribe for more of our content. You can also find all of our videos and clips on youtube.com. Just search Let Them Eat Bread and you'll find all of our content. All right, guys, see you next time. Bye for now.